Welcome. And now, kicking off your digital journey, Steve Wilson.
Hi, I'm excited to welcome you to the kickoff for Citrix Converge 2020, the world's premier developers conference focused on the future of work. Last year in 2019, I was excited to welcome about 100 of you to our Silicon Valley offices for our very first developers conference. But this year, I'm excited to welcome the thousands of you from around the globe who pre-registered for this event. The future of work is a concept that is accelerated in 2020 like no year previously. And software developers have a key role in how we're going to accelerate the move to more engaging and more productive work. And that's going to be the focus of this conference. And so to kick things off, we've invited a special guest speaker. I'm excited to introduce Stephen O'Grady from RedMonk. He's one of the founders of that industry analyst firm, and he is focused on the concept of software developers. And in fact, he's well known as the author of a book called The New Kingmakers: How Developers Conquered the World. And really what Stephen will do is give you some idea of where software development's going and the role that you as a developer can play in this transformation that's coming. After Stephen, we're going to have two of our leaders from Citrix, Pat Patterson and Sonny Chhen, introduce you to the different tracks and the overall organization of the event. So after this, you'll be ready to dive in and get all the great content. So Stephen, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world as you listen to my voice today. I am Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of RedMonk. RedMonk, if you are unfamiliar with us, is a developer-focused industry analyst firm. And that just means that we do research into technical trends, directions, and so on from a practitioner standpoint. So a practitioner could be a traditional application developer. It could be somebody more like an operator. It could be a sysadmin. It could be a business analyst. It could be a DBA. It could be somebody who's basically scripting all this together, right? Trying to sort of put the pieces together, as it were. And in many cases, it's somebody who doesn't code at all. Basically, if you are in the trenches, if you're doing the work every day, you're the type of person that we care about, and you're the type of person, frankly, that we try to learn from. And speaking of learning from, the purpose of today's talk is to talk about the future of work. Now, at RedMonk, one of our core theses all along has been that the developer is what we refer to as the new kingmaker. And what we mean by that is that the developer sets the technical direction. And therefore, when we talk about the future of work, what we're honestly talking about is learning from all of you in terms of what you're using, why you're using it, and how you might be using it in future to extract from that a picture of what the future might look like. And more specifically, as we're here to discuss today, what the future of work might look like. So with that introduction, what I wanted to do was just go through, sort of the some of the underpinnings of the thesis. So to understand where we're headed, we need to understand how we got here, and more importantly, why, all of that has come to pass. So, really, when we go around and talk to businesses today, when we go out and talk, at any level of the enterprise, whether that is the executives, sort of at the top, making sort of quote unquote the decisions, or whether it's the folks in the trenches, as we talked about, we hear the same thing, right? Which is that the world has changed. The world is changing, and the world is changing at an accelerating rate. You can see it, you can feel it, you can smell it. It is a completely different world today than it was 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. And, there are a couple of reasons for that. We don't have time to go through them all today, but we'll go through a couple of them. So the first and sort of most obvious, I think for most of us is open source. So this particular picture is a shot from FOSDEM. FOSDEM is an event held in Brussels every year that is a gathering of thousands and thousands and thousands of open source developers. They come to talk about their projects. They come to talk about how they're going to develop them moving forward. And they come to talk about issues that affect sort of open source more broadly. And I bring this up because open source was a transformative phenomenon from a technology industry perspective. Now, I probably don't need to tell anybody in the audience that. You probably all have sort of lived this day to day, but it really is important to sort of emphasize that as a point of focus. So, when I was a systems integrator many years ago, if we wanted to do anything for one of our clients, just a proof of concept, essentially a toy project here and there, we had to go somewhere and obtain licenses for software. If we wanted an operating system, we needed a license for that. If we wanted a database, we needed a license for that, and so on. With the advent of open source, sort of beginning in sort of the late 90s, and frankly, if you actually look at the early roots of this industry, going back to the the mainframe days in the 50s, they behaved, the users of that, the mainframes behaved in a way that we would today call open source. They didn't have the term, obviously, at that time, but they shared changes, fixes, patches, and so on. But anyhow, fast forwarding to today, open source has gone from essentially a science project to essentially the backbone of mainstream infrastructure at every level of the stack. No matter what the business, no matter sort of what the industry, no matter how big or small it is relying on open source in some way, in some form, in some fashion. And this is particularly important from a developer standpoint because they don't have to, if you're a developer today, you don't have to jump through the same hoops to get your business to use open source the way that you used to. And it directly empowers you in ways that, again, were unthinkable in the days when you had to go to somebody and ask for license and ask for permission to use something. So open source has provided developers with this embarrassment of riches, if you will. Anything they could possibly want: operating system, database, sort of application platform layer, tooling, CI/CD, anything they want is available somewhere as open source software. So, they have this huge wealth of assets. The next question is, okay, fine, where do I run it? So, the obvious answer, again, probably for most of us in this industry, is the cloud. Not everything, certainly will be in the cloud. That is that's a mistake. I think that a lot of people make, that they believe this is a binary either or situation. We personally don't believe that. But the truth is that a lot of the growth is going to come from cloud environments. A lot of the growth is going to come from deployments that are off premises in one way or another. And again, from a developer standpoint, this was enormously empowering, because instead of having to go to someone and sort of beg for hardware, a developer can sort of pick this up and run with it, because it's pay as you go and the rates are eminently affordable, even if you're just sort of playing around with a toy project. So there's a gentleman by the name of Flip Cromer who many years ago said EC2 means that anyone with a $10 bill can afford a 10-node cluster of distributed compute backed by a terabyte of storage for 8 hours. Now, that's more true today than it even was then, because the prices have come down, since that quote was issued. But the point remains, prior to the cloud, there was no way to do that. I couldn't get a 10-node cluster, for 8 hours, right? I would have to go out and find that hardware and buy it, and then find somewhere to run it, find power, cooling, all of that. The cloud profoundly transformed developers' access, to underlying infrastructure and underlying hardware. So that's great. I have this infrastructure software that I can run. I have a place that I can run it, sort of in the cloud. But how do I develop? Well, the good news is that, again, developers have this huge array, this huge portfolio of software at their disposal from a tool standpoint. We've had obviously text editors available for forever, effectively. Things like VI and Emacs. But all of the sort of new tooling, VS Code is popular. Many of you are probably using it. Obviously, an open source project. And developers have the opportunity to, again, pick and choose from this wealth of software that is available from a tool standpoint to build, test, deploy, scan, do all of the individual steps that are necessary to take an asset from the first couple lines of code and deploy it all the way out to a production environment. So, again, let's sort of think through this. We have the infrastructure software, we have the place to run it, we have the tools, to develop the application in the first place. But how do we get trained? Well, again, the good news, from a developer standpoint is that education has never been more affordable, than it is today, at least outside of the official channels, I should say. Again, sort of hearkening back to the days, sort of when, sort of a lot of us had sort of come up, and if you wanted to learn a particular piece of software, if you wanted to be trained in a particular tool, you had to go and find budget to take an expensive course on that. I went through that. I'm sure many of you have as well. These days, a lot of that training is online for free. Whether it's in sort of properties like a Coursera, or educational institutions like MIT, making, their curriculums available, sort of online via projects like edX, or frankly, or maybe it's, just you're doing what I do with a home improvement project. I can tell you, I have done a lot of home improvement in my time, and the first thing I do in every case is just go to YouTube, because somebody has done it there and can show me how to do it. And so developers today, have never had a better opportunity to educate themselves, to up-level their talent, to up-level their skills, via, again, sort of this huge volume of free information and free education. So, some of the developers, of course, are going to want to, go out and build businesses, right? And sort of take advantage of, hey, I have a good idea. I want to go out and build something. How do I do that? So, the answer to that is they need access to capital, right? They need access to funding. And, this is a piece of research that we did a long time ago. The numbers were gathered by a gentleman by the name of Chris Tacey. And, we put these together and charted it out. And it's interesting because, as you can see, for most of the last decade, or the better part of the last decade, the deal volume and deal size, for angel and venture deals were pretty tightly coupled. One would go up, one would go down, and they were, sort of relatively on the same trajectory up until about 2006, at which point they decoupled and, have essentially since been headed in opposite directions. The natural question, of course, is why? Well, there are a variety of potential answers. The one that we subscribe to at RedMonk is that 2006 saw the creation of the cloud era, and all of a sudden developers could purchase this hardware for either for free or at a very low cost in ways they fundamentally couldn't before. So if you wanted to start a business, instead of having to go out and spend a great deal of money on servers and infrastructure up front, you could amortize that over time by purchasing it essentially on demand, as you need to via cloud services. So, from a developer standpoint, this meant, I don't need as much money to start a business. So you can see the implications of this in this chart. The total volume of deals goes up, but the size of those deals goes down. And, the simple sort of takeaway there is that if it costs less to fund a business, I can therefore fund more of them and take more shots. So again, if we sort of think through the developer progression here, if we think through the steps that have empowered them over the past 2 decades, open source has given them sort of more infrastructure software to leverage for their projects and on behalf of their employers. The cloud has put hardware, any type of hardware, any size of hardware, directly in their hands. The tools available to them have increased dramatically, and they have better access to education and better access to funding than they've ever had. This puts developers and practitioners squarely in the driver's seat from our perspective, and we see this play out time after time after time. So, sort of one inevitable impact of this has been a pre-Cambrian explosion sort of in the array of technologies that are available to businesses and developers today. So, for those of you who are not paleozoologists, I don't happen to be one either, for most of its early lifespan, life on Earth was extremely limited, right? It was limited to essentially single-cell organisms, that were, very, very simple, sort of in their construction. Along about the pre-Cambrian period, however, there was this explosion in diversity, explosion sort of in the multiplication of different types of life on this planet for reasons that are not terribly well understood. That is essentially what we have seen, the metaphorical equivalent, anyhow, within the software industry. We have gone from, a single monolith database, to many types of databases. We've gone from a single deployment model, the typical client server 3-tier architecture, to dozens or more. We have seen this tremendous flowering of sort of types and categories and options, from a software standpoint. So, on the one hand, this is great because it provides developers with choices. On the other hand, it's a challenge, for developers as well, because they have to make many, many more choices than they used to. They have to learn many more technologies than they used to. So this is both sort of pro and con. But, again, when you're in a leadership position, that comes with it comes with some downside. It comes with some responsibility. So further evidence of this, sort of developers as sort of new kingmakers phenomenon is the world in which we find ourselves today, which is essentially a polyglot world, a polyglot environment where, the old days, where an enterprise might sanction one language, might be Java or something from the Microsoft stack. Those days are by and large gone. For the most part, enterprises today are dealing with sort of multiple languages, essentially taking a best tool for the job approach, such that within the same application architecture, in fact, you may see multiple different runtimes used, right? We had a conversation just last week with somebody building an application that uses Go, JavaScript, and Python, for some of the glue code, sort of to put some of the individual pieces together. So that's 3 languages in just one application, let alone sort of within the enterprise itself. So we live in a polyglot world, and again, this is exactly what you would expect if developers were in charge, because enterprises by and large would prefer the simplicity of a single language, the simplicity of sort of one language, one approach to essentially mandate and run, sort of on an ongoing basis. But that's not what developers want. Which brings us to this particular diagram. This is actually taken from a book that I had written some years ago called The New Kingmakers, and it depicts the sort of reality that we see on a day-to-day basis, right? Which is, the top circle here, of course, is what IT thinks is being used. The bottom left circle is what developers want to use, and the punchline here, of course, is that what is actually being used has the greatest overlap with what developers themselves want to use. So this is the reality that we see. This is the reality that we experience, and this is a reality that most of the individuals that we talk to, be they individual developers or folks sort of running that those organizations, the CIOs, the CTOs, and so forth of the world see. This is essentially the reality, which is developers are dictating the approach, the technologies that are being used today and moving forward. So they are de facto kingmakers at this point, which means that businesses are at a crossroads. So the background on this particular chart, for those of you who are not aware, it may be a little confusing. I come from the great state of Maine. The early settlers of the state were undoubtedly hardy people. They were not terribly creative, with their names. So they just picked countries randomly to name their cities and towns. So this is a signpost from South China, Maine, I believe. And as you can see, this is the crossroads here will take you to China, Poland, Peru, Norway, Mexico, Sweden, Denmark, Lebanon, all from the great state of Maine. And metaphorically, again, that's where most of the businesses we talk to are today, right? They're looking at this and saying, okay, I have these choices moving forward. What do I do? How do I run this? If developers are the new kingmakers, what does that mean for me? And if I'm a developer, how do I leverage sort of that newfound influence, that newfound responsibility? Well, generally speaking, there's 2 choices you can make. So the first is you can, you can try to sort of follow in the footsteps of King Canute. Many of you may be familiar with this sort of old adage, but anyhow, as the story goes, this famous Scandinavian king had himself taken down to the beach, placed in, sort of by the water, and issued a royal decree that the tide should stop moving. And sort of as the saying goes, the tide rose as usual, and dashed over his feet and legs without respect to his royal person, because, of course, you can't fight the tide. So, we see this. We see, sort of many organizations, today trying to fight, the developers that work for them, trying to essentially tamp that down, trying to prevent them from doing the things that they want to do. There's no hard and fast. There may be situations where that is the correct approach. We have yet to see it, however. Instead, what we see progressive organizations doing today, and the organizations that are taking, having the sort of most success, is they're easing off the brake. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean, sort of as the old Facebook adage, discredited, I should add, Facebook adage goes, that you move fast and break things. That's not what we're talking about. But, organizations, that, take their foot off the brake for once are finding that moving as quickly as their developers want to move actually is imperative for them. Because the world that they find themselves in today is a highly, highly competitive world, and one that is dominated by digital players. So if you're a digital native, you have digital natives you're competing with that are moving quickly. If you are a market incumbent, you are competing with digital natives, and they are moving at speeds that the incumbents have never seen before. So, for the first time, the business imperative is actually to move as quickly as the developers typically want to move. So, the best thing that you can do from a leadership standpoint is, again, try to get out of the developer's way to the extent that you can. And from a developer standpoint, this is your opportunity to show that you have the responsibility to move quickly, but to do so safely. And part of it is that, sort of from an experiential perspective, this is something to think about. We talk about at RedMonk the developer experience gap. And what we mean by that is that if we think back to sort of the top of this presentation, we talked about all of the open source software that's available, all the various cloud infrastructure that can be leveraged, and the tools the developers now have access to. The industry to date, has largely tried to offer these, sort of as piecemeal solutions, rather than sort of thinking about it experientially. And the impact of this from a developer standpoint is that developers then become responsible for taking all these individual pieces and gluing them and duct taping them and sort of wrapping them in baling wire to try to get these sort of multifaceted, multi-vendor, complicated workflows essentially to market, and then to support and sustain them over time. That's not a realistic and that's not a sustainable sort of approach moving forward. So for all of you sort of catering to developer populations, or for sort of all the developers in the audience, think about the experience. Think about how the individual tools that you use work together, or frankly don't, because that is an opportunity to optimize your experience moving forward. If you can get these, if you can get the individual pieces working together and working together smoothly, you're going to be much happier over the longer term, and more importantly for you and sort of the enterprise you work for, you're going to be able to move more quickly. And speaking of moving quickly, part of sort of the best practice, if you will, for progressive organizations today is to think of everything they can as code, including their infrastructure. Right, so this is the infrastructure as code is a term that many of you have probably heard of before, but basically it comes down to anything that can be sort of rendered and managed via software should be. That is the sort of approach that you want to be taking moving forward, because that is the approach ultimately that's going to allow you to operate at the highest velocity. One of the other big trends, sort of that we have seen, that is, sort of hugely, hugely important, and really a guiding trend moving forward, is the sort of opportunity to try to make some your problems somebody else's problems. So the logical question here is that we're talking about technology. Why do we have a picture of why are we looking at a picture of Tom Sawyer's fence? Well, the short answer is because time and time again, what we hear from developers and enterprises alike is, I would like to take sort of this aspect of an application, an architecture, an infrastructure, and essentially outsource it, to say, I'm not seeing any value in running this. So the canonical example here, of course, is cloud infrastructure, right? To say, I'm not seeing a lot of value in running my own compute storage, or sort of later on databases and so on. And therefore, I'd like to find somebody to manage that for me. More recently, we're seeing this with higher level services, right? It could be security, it could be identity, it could be authorization, it could be search, call it what you will. Basically, what we're seeing developers and enterprises focus on today are, how do I focus most of my time and most of my attention on writing the application that's valuable to me? And how do I take out these generic pieces that somebody else can run and manage probably better than I can, and outsource that to a qualified third party? So what we're seeing here essentially is, the accelerated adoption of managed services up and down the food chain to make a developer's life simpler. So they can go and write an application and not have to rewrite, pieces that have already been written 1,000 times. And then lastly, when we talk to progressive organizations today, one of the things that we emphasize and one of the things that we stress is that you need to focus on the people. If any of you listening to this have been through a DevOps initiative within your organization, you already know this. If you haven't, I recommend you talk to someone who has, because one of the first things that everyone who has been, sort of in that boat understands is that it's not purely a technical problem. Basically, when we look at modern software development organizations today, ones that are top of class and operate at high speed, they have good people and good processes to support and surround those people. They don't drop in a product, they don't drop in a service, and magically everything is fixed. They have the people and culture that knows how to leverage high quality products in smart ways to make sure that things move more quickly. So, as you sort of think about, sort of your approach moving forward, those of you running organizations, how do you support your developers? How do you give them the tools that they need? And how do you, sort of institute a workflow or a process that allows them the flexibility and, the responsibility to sort of move as quickly as they want to move? And just as importantly, from a developer standpoint, how do you support and sort of up-level the people around you? How do you work better with teams, whether they're sitting next to you or whether they're sitting somewhere, across the planet? The focus on the people and the focus on the workflows and the processes around those people are ultimately what's going to make the difference, between an organization that will survive and thrive, sort of in this new world, or an organization that is going to, not survive and thrive. So with that, I am Stephen O'Grady. I am not terribly difficult to find online. There's my Twitter handle, it's my email address. The book I've mentioned here is called The New Kingmakers. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Stephen. And welcome everybody to Citrix Converge 2020. Now, in designing this conference, we thought hard about how best to serve you, our developer community. And we actually use the term developers in a very inclusive sense. When most people talk about developers, they're thinking about coders who are writing with high-level languages, perhaps Java or C# in an IDE, creating applications. Now, this is actually a very small fragment of our developer community. We actually have many more scripters who are using tools like Python or PowerShell to automate operations, to create infrastructure as code, or to integrate different systems. And finally, we have builders using low-code, no-code tools such as microapps or Podio to create applications that, to the untrained eye, are indistinguishable from those created using more traditional means. And of course, we want to serve anybody who aspires to be in one of those categories. Now, when it comes to the themes of the conference, we went to you, our community, and asked you what your concerns are. And you told us that a major concern is cloud migration. You have skills that you've built up over years in an on-premise environment, and now you want to leverage them as your enterprises move systems to the cloud. You want to make your own lives easier. Who doesn't? You want to automate away the grunt work and focus on the important tasks at hand. And also, you want to do the same for your employees, improving their productivity by removing repetitive tasks. And we're doing this all within the framework of Citrix's different product lines. Now, we've actually organized this conference into 3 tracks, loosely based on those product families here at Citrix. We have the apps and desktop virtualization track. So here we focus on tools such as CVAD and analytics and that family of technology. We have the app delivery and security track, a product family that was until very recently known as networking. And here you'll find sessions devoted to ADC, SD-WAN and the like. And then finally, we have the app creation and collaboration track. And this is where people who have previously come to Converge will probably congregate around micro apps and Podio and so on. Now, before we move on into the logistics of the conference, I'd just like to say a big thank you to our speakers. We have close to 100 different speakers over the course of this 2 weeks, and they've built their sessions under interesting conditions. We're all working at home right now, or the vast majority of us, and while we might imagine that the process is like this, we can kick back, make a cup of tea and work on our slides. I know that for a lot of us, this is a more realistic scenario. We've been up against deadlines. We've been building slide decks, recording presentations, as well as doing our day jobs. So just a huge thank you to everybody who has contributed to this conference. We literally could not do it without you. So with that, I'd like to hand over to our developer Evangelism Manager, Sonny Chhen.
Thanks, Pat. As part of Citrix Converge 2020, we'll be having a hackathon. Here are the 6 key things that you need to know. The hackathon will be open to all developers, with a focus on our virtual apps and desktops, networking, and micro app technology. The who is you. All developers, builders, scripters, and coders. Even if you don't write code for a living, we have low-code and no-code building technology that will help you create submissions for the hackathon. The hackathon takes place on November 2nd, starting at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and ending on November 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. This is a global hackathon open up to all developers. We'll have mentors to help troubleshoot and provide assistance with any issues that may arise with submissions that participants may need help with. Why? Why not? We here at Citrix value our developer community, and we look forward to seeing all the innovation that occurs within these hackathons and what can be done with our Citrix products and how to pave the way for the future of work. And how are we able to do this? Because we have amazing developers, partners, and sponsors willing to put in the time, money, and effort in the spirit of innovation, sharing, and competition. Now that you know the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the event, don't forget to check out our breakout sessions with the videos on demand, as well as joining our QA sessions with the breakout speakers, or our coffee chat sessions with Citrix leadership to talk about the future of technology and the Citrix product line. And don't forget to enter the hackathon, where you can win some cool prizes. I'll see you during Citrix Converge.